Have you ever noticed how certain people seem to have an almost uncanny influence over the environment around them without even speaking much? They don't raise their voice. They don't plead or chase. They simply step back. And suddenly, everything shifts. The atmosphere changes. People start questioning, searching, feeling uneasy or drawn in. Now imagine if you did the same. If you stopped reacting instantly to everything, if you chose silence instead of automatic replies, withdrawal instead of emotional explosion, what do you think would happen? That is exactly where the deeper point begins. When you are no longer constantly available emotionally, physically, and mentally, the environment around you starts to react differently. People who are used to your predictable responses suddenly feel a gap. They begin to question, to pursue, to test boundaries. Because many are accustomed to controlling you through your reactions, your impulses, your immediate emotional availability. But the moment you withdraw consciously, the dynamic changes completely. Those who believed they understood you realize they barely knew you at all. Carl Jung once said that everything that irritates us about others can lead us toward a deeper understanding of ourselves. Now reflect on that. When you become less reachable, who becomes unsettled? Who feels irritated? Who suddenly tries to provoke you just to extract a reaction? This reveals far more about them than it does about you. And more importantly, it exposes how often you may still be influenced without noticing it. You keep giving your time, attention, and emotional energy just to maintain peace, to avoid conflict, to keep people who may have never truly valued your presence. With every forced agreement, every instant reply, every emotional overextension, you slowly drain your own internal energy. And at the end of the day, what remains is exhaustion, frustration, and a quiet emptiness that is difficult to explain. But the reason is simple. You have been too available for people who did not deserve even your silence. This is not about rejecting the world or becoming distant from life. It is about choosing yourself. It connects with what Jung called individuation, the process of becoming whole, integrated, and authentic. This begins the moment you understand that silence can carry more strength than endless arguments. That stepping back, when done consciously rather than out of fear, is not weakness, but control. So the question becomes, how long will you allow your emotional state to be dictated by others? How long will you keep reacting like a mechanism every time someone presses your emotional triggers? Perhaps it is time to cut those invisible strings, to step back, to become less predictable. Because when you are no longer constantly available, everything around you begins to rearrange itself. From a young age, people are often trained to stay present, to respond quickly, to please, to agree even when they internally disagree. Over time, this builds a belief that your value comes from how accessible you are to others. But there is a truth rarely spoken so directly. Excessive availability is not a virtue. It becomes a form of limitation, a quiet kind of psychological trap. As long as you believe you must always be reachable emotionally or otherwise, you remain open to being drained, manipulated, or taken for granted. Predictability makes you easy to use. When people can anticipate your reactions, they start interacting with you as a resource rather than a person. You become a kind of emotional outlet they turn to when needed and set aside when they are done. Carl Jung described the persona as the social mask we wear to be accepted and valued. Often, it is this mask that keeps people overly available. You say, "It's fine," when it is not. You respond immediately even when you are drained. You explain yourself repeatedly as if you owe constant justification for your existence. Meanwhile, the more you center yourself in others' expectations, the more you drift away from your own inner world. Being always available becomes a subtle form of self-abandonment. It turns into a hidden search for approval and a fear of rejection. But this comes with a cost: your inner peace, your energy, your clarity. Your life force begins to scatter in every direction, as if it were unlimited, when in reality, it is not. People who demand constant availability rarely want your true self. They want what you provide: attention, validation, comfort, emotional regulation. And the moment you set a boundary or refuse to react instantly, their attitude shifts. They may become irritated, distant, or even critical. Not because you have done something wrong, but because you are no longer serving the role they assigned to you. Here lies the uncomfortable truth. The more available you are, the less value some people assign to you. What is always accessible begins to lose perceived importance. Human attention tends to value what is earned, not what is constantly given without effort. So the real reflection becomes, who genuinely deserves your time, your attention, your presence? And equally important, who benefits from your absence more than your presence? Before answering that, there is something deeper to understand. Why do we react so quickly? Why do we feel compelled to respond, explain, defend, or please almost automatically? This is where the concept of psychic energy becomes important. Carl Jung viewed the psyche not as a passive structure, but as an energy system. Every thought, emotion, and reaction draws from that limited internal energy. The real question is whether you are directing that energy consciously or letting external circumstances and other people dictate where it flows. Every impulsive reaction consumes energy. Responding to unnecessary criticism, engaging in meaningless arguments, trying to prove yourself to those who are not interested in understanding you, or overextending yourself to gain approval. All of this drains your internal resources. Jung suggested that what you constantly resist or react to tends to persist and strengthen. The more you engage impulsively, the more entangled you become. People who are emotionally exhausted are not necessarily weak. They are often misdirected, scattering their energy in too many unproductive directions. And prolonged exhaustion creates vulnerability. When you are depleted, you become easier to influence. People who rely on manipulation or emotional pressure often recognize this instinctively. They notice who reacts quickly, who over-explains, who cannot tolerate silence, and they use that pattern to their advantage. A well-balanced psyche is one that knows how to retain energy internally. It understands the power of pause, of silence, of delayed response. It knows when to say no without guilt, when to stay quiet without feeling inferior, and when to observe instead of immediately acting. True strength is not in constant reaction. It lies in conscious choice. In deciding when your energy is worth spending and when it is not. Think about how many times you have replayed conversations in your mind long after they ended. How many nights were spent analyzing words, intentions, or tone? That is energy continuing to flow towards something that no longer exists in reality. You are feeding mental echoes that should have faded. Psychic energy behaves like an internal field. When it is protected, it creates presence, stability, and calm authority. People can sense it without explanation. But when it is scattered, you become reactive, unstable, and easily influenced by external moods and opinions. That is why awareness of your triggers becomes essential. What situations pull you into automatic reaction? What kinds of people destabilize your emotional center? These are not random irritations. They are precise points where your energy leaks. The goal is not to become cold or disconnected. It is to become selective, intentional, grounded in yourself rather than constantly pulled outward. And here is where a deeper psychological mechanism appears. When you begin conserving your energy, you start breaking the unconscious projections others place onto you. And this disrupts established dynamics, especially those built on emotional dependence and subtle manipulation. Because there are people who do not interact with you directly as you are, but through what they project onto you. You become a screen for their unresolved emotions, expectations, and needs. And if you are constantly available, you unconsciously allow that projection to continue without interruption. You may notice certain patterns. People who only contact you during crises, relationships where you are expected to fix emotional instability, or individuals who value you only as long as you fulfill a function in their life. The moment you stop reacting the same way, the dynamic shifts, and sometimes discomfort emerges, not in you, but in them, because the pattern they relied on no longer works. None of this is accidental. They are not actually relating to you. They are relating to the version of you they have constructed in their mind, the role you have unconsciously agreed to perform. And why do you agree to it? Because of fear. Fear of disappointing others, fear of being unloved, fear of abandonment. The most subtle and effective form of manipulation does not come through shouting or force. It lives inside silence, inside guilt. When you feel you owe people your attention, your help, your immediate response, even when it slowly drains you inside, that is where control begins. And here is the central truth. A manipulator does not need to control you directly. They only need you to keep responding in the same predictable way. But the moment you stop reacting automatically, the entire structure starts collapsing. When you begin to say no, when you choose silence instead of explanation, when you withdraw instead of over-justifying yourself, the projection they had placed on you starts breaking apart. The image they built of you begins to fall. This collapse makes people uncomfortable because suddenly they no longer know how to define you. And even more disturbing for them, they are forced to confront themselves. Not everyone is willing to face that reflection. Your unavailability becomes a disruption because it forces others to encounter their own inner emptiness. The silence you carry exposes the internal noise they were avoiding all along. And then comes resistance, criticism, emotional reactions, guilt tripping. Not because you are wrong, but because you are no longer playing the role they depended on. Carl Jung said that we do not reach awareness by imagining light, but by making the unconscious darkness conscious. When you withdraw, when you stop feeding the cycle of reaction, the shadow in others begins to surface. And that is unbearable for those who have long relied on you as an emotional escape or regulator. But then the question turns toward you. Are you ready for the discomfort of being misunderstood, of being misjudged, even of being rejected for the sake of protecting your own peace? Are you prepared for the silence that follows emotional separation? Because it is within that silence that a different kind of strength begins to emerge. And that is where everything begins to change. In that space, you start realizing that silence is not emptiness. It is awareness. The modern world is filled with noise. Everyone wants to respond instantly, to be heard, to win arguments, to prove their point, even at the cost of their own inner stability. But there exists a power that very few understand and even fewer master. The power of silence. Not the silence of avoidance or weakness, but conscious, deliberate, clear silence. A silence that is not absence, but presence in its most controlled form. Jung did not see silence as emptiness, but as a space for transformation. When you stop reacting, you begin to observe. And through observation, you start noticing patterns that were always there, but hidden beneath your reactions. Emotional cycles, manipulation loops, repeated self-destructive behaviors. Silence brings clarity. And clarity becomes dangerous for those who depend on your reactions to maintain control. Have you ever noticed how some people become unsettled when you stop responding, when you do not explain yourself? It is not because they miss you, it is because your silence removes their ability to control the narrative. As long as you are reacting, you are still participating in the system. But when you stop responding, you change the rules entirely. And that shift destabilizes those who depend on emotional access to you. True silence is not just the absence of speech, It is mastery over your internal energy. It is refusing to be pulled into emotional patterns that do not belong to you. Jung described individuation as the process of becoming whole by separating from collective expectations. And silence becomes part of that process, because only in silence can you hear yourself without distortion. But silence always comes with a cost. It distances you from people who only valued your availability. It confuses those who only understood you through projection. It may even make you appear cold or distant, but often that perception comes from those who were never connected to your depth, only to your utility. And here is the difficult truth. As you grow, you naturally become more selective with your words, because you begin to understand that energy is not infinite. Every response carries weight, and not every situation deserves access to your attention. Sometimes silence is not withdrawal, it is sovereignty. It is the quiet authority of someone who no longer feels the need to justify existence. Silence unsettles people because it forces them into self-reflection. It reveals their own thoughts, their own discomfort. And that reaction tells you more about them than any argument ever could. You do not need to explain your absence. It explains itself. And those who feel threatened by it often reveal how dependent they were on your emotional instability or availability to maintain their own sense of control. But the most powerful form of silence is not the one that affects others. It is the one that rebuilds you internally. The silence that reconnects you with yourself beyond external expectations. In that inner space, free from pressure, you begin to recover your energy and return to your own center. It becomes clear that understanding all of this intellectually means very little if your behavior remains unchanged. If you continue saying yes when you want to say no, replying when you should stay silent, staying in conversations that drain you, and maintaining connections purely out of habit, then awareness remains incomplete. Real change begins with conscious decisions. Learning to become selective is not about coldness or arrogance. It is about reclaiming your time, your attention, and your emotional stability. It starts with small shifts, not replying instantly, pausing before reacting, stepping away from draining conversations, and allowing silence to exist without guilt. You do not owe constant explanations for your boundaries. Every explanation you give often becomes another point of negotiation for others to pull you back into old patterns. Jung's concept of individuation includes a necessary phase of separation, not depressive isolation, but sacred solitude. A space where you can finally hear your own thoughts clearly. And during this process, one of the clearest indicators of change is observing who becomes uncomfortable with your new boundaries. Who gets triggered when you stop reacting? Who accuses you of changing when you begin protecting your peace? These reactions are not signs of your failure, but signs of your growth. At first, unavailability feels uncomfortable. Guilt may appear. Doubt may arise. You might question whether you are being too distant or too strict. But this discomfort is part of restructuring your inner world. You are stepping out of patterns that once defined you. Conscious unavailability becomes the foundation of self-respect. Every time you say no to external pressure, you are saying yes to your internal peace. Every time you step away from emotional chaos, you are choosing stability over illusion. And when you stop over-explaining yourself, something subtle but powerful happens. Respect begins to emerge, even if quietly, even if from a distance. Not everyone will understand this shift because your emotional absence removes the structure they were used to depending on. This absence reveals their dependency more than your behavior. It exposes how much they relied on your availability to maintain balance in their own lives. And when that balance is disrupted, reactions follow. Confusion, resistance, distance. But what follows after all of this? After the separation, after the silence, after the discomfort, something new begins to form. a transition that cannot happen without letting go of what no longer serves you. When you stop being constantly available to everyone, a deep internal silence begins to unfold. At first, it feels heavy, almost unsettling. You question your choices. You wonder if distance was the right decision. But slowly, that silence starts to shift. It becomes lighter, clearer, more grounding. And then solitude appears, not as absence, but as presence. A different kind of presence, a space where you are no longer performing for others. This is the solitude of strength, the state of no longer betraying yourself just to maintain connection. Within that space, confusion begins to dissolve. Anxiety starts to fade. Emotional dependency weakens. And in its place, something more stable emerges. Clarity. A sense of being anchored within yourself without needing external validation to feel complete. Carl Jung described individuation as the process of separating from collective expectations in order to become fully oneself. It requires detachment from roles, from masks, from the need to constantly be understood. It requires walking through a phase where you stand alone, not as punishment, but as transformation. And in that solitude, something powerful begins to grow. Inner alignment. The ability to exist without constant external reinforcement. The realization that peace was never outside of you, but something that was always accessible once noise is removed. This is where real freedom begins, not in constant connection, but in the ability to remain whole even in isolation.